These folks are here, but he's a well-known author. He's a national speaker. He has been interviewed on ABC and CBS, Fox News, and been quoted in many publications and referred to from documentation that are published by others. So he's well-rounded. He publishes books on anywhere from Islam to history, American history, the founders, and the biblical truth that this country is based upon. So he has a wide range of topics. He's very well versed on all of them, and I think you're really going to enjoy this tonight. So, Bill, if you just come up and we'll get this on the road.
Well, thank you, Jerry, and I want to thank Jerry and his wife for inviting me up and helping to organize the different events we're at. And I also want to thank Andy and the tremendous work going on here. So you're the hope of the country. I heard someone say a big shot's just a little shot away from home. So my wife reminds me of that. So we're going to talk some history of Islam, but we're going to jump back to learning current by looking at the sort of the recent past. I'm going to go ahead and hold this because then I can turn a little bit more. We're going to talk about the decline of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire, at its greatest extent, covered all of Europe. All of the Eastern Europe, and then the Middle East, Turkey, Syria, Egypt, North Africa. It went through three stages. The first was an expanding stage from 1299 to 1683. And it conquered. So people forget, Egypt used to be Christian, evangelized by Mark, who wrote the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, until the Muslims conquered it. North Africa used to be Christian. There was 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century. St. Augustine of Hippo was from Carthage. Today that's in Tunisia. But the Muslims conquered them all. Then they conquered Spain, held it for 700 years. And then the Muslims conquered Syria, which was completely Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. Antioch, Syria, is where the name Christian was first used until Caliph Umar conquered it. And then the Turks invaded into what is today Turkey. People forget Turkey used to be completely Christian. It was the Byzantine Empire. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were all there, and they were all wiped out. The letters in the New Testament to Ephesus and Colossae and Galatia and Philippi and Corinth, all those cities were wiped out by the Turkish Muslims. The West comes to their rescue. It's called the Crusades. Only lasts a couple centuries. Muslims pick up where they left off, and they conquer Constantinople and then invade into Eastern Europe. And they're at the gates of Vienna in 1529, and then again in 1683. So there's Vienna, and this is the Ottoman Empire at its peak. And then it goes through a declining stage. It's a collapsing stage. As a matter of fact, every empire goes through these 3 stages. So when the Roman Empire was expanding, it was living off the people it conquered. And then when they finally built Hadrian's Wall and said this far and no further, they had to learn to live within their means, and they didn't, and they got in debt. And then Rome began to get invaded by illegal immigrants, the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Anglos and Saxons, a lot of our old ancestors, and then the Roman Empire fell. The Spanish Empire, right? The sun never set on the Spanish Empire. As it's expanding, it's living off of the different places it's conquering, taking all the gold from Peru, right, taking it back. And then it went through a maintaining stage and then a collapsing stage. The Soviets did the same thing, right? Expanded, then they had to learn how to maintain, and they couldn't keep up with our arms race, and then they ended up going bankrupt. The Mongols did the same thing. Genghis Khan conquering, live off the conquered peoples, and then they had to, maintain and manage what they had conquered, and then Kublai Khan printed too much paper currency, and the Mongolian Empire collapsed. So the same thing happened with the Ottoman Empire. Goes through this expanding stage, then it goes through this maintaining, and then the collapsing stage. Now, when it's going through the collapsing stage, the other countries of Europe begin to fill in the power vacuum. and they begin to exert their influence. So France begins to exert its influence in Algeria, and England in Egypt and Sudan, and southern part of Arabia, and then Russia into the northern part of Persia, which today is Iran, and you even had Italy trying to get into Ethiopia and all kinds of things. But these are the main powers, British, Ottoman, and then the Russian influence. And so the Ottoman Empire was called the sick man of Europe. And here is their Sultan, Abdul Hameed, and he has 13 wives and 3 concubines. And what does he do? He sees these other countries exerting their influence into his former domain. And there are little minority groups wanting to break away from the Ottoman Empire. Like Greece breaks away from the Ottoman Empire in the early 1800s. And then the middle 1800s, you got Bulgaria breaking away, and Romania, and Wallachia, Moldova, and Hungary. They're all flexing their muscles and breaking away from the sick man of Europe. A little country called Armenia wants to break away too. And Sultan Abdul Hameed said, enough breaking away. Let's crush these people before they break away. And so Abdul Hameed cracked down on the minorities, and it was bloody. And so they killed 100,000 Armenian Christians and Syrian Christians in the year 1896. Grover Cleveland was our president, and he said, the outbreaks of blind fury occur suddenly without notice, and Christian men, women, and children are martyred for their profession of their Christian faith. And this is Grover Cleveland writing a presidential report to Congress. And that's Abdul Hameed. Well, as the Ottoman Empire is collapsing, if it was just left alone, it would have fell under its own weight. It would have collapsed like the Mongolian Empire and like the Spanish Empire and like the others. But something happened. Oil. Now, in the 1800s, where did oil come from?
Whales.
Whales. And these whales were being chased to the edge of extinction. Right? You had the Nantucket and the Massachusetts and all the Connecticut, all these whaling ships going all around the world, and they would take the blubber from the whale and get the oil out of it and turn their little lamps on. Well, other countries started coming online, and they were chasing the whales, and they were this close to going extinct until the whales were saved by oil being discovered in the ground. In 1859 in Pennsylvania, the Drake oil well, and then in Oklahoma. And so now the whale is saved. We're getting oil out of the ground. It's not hurting anybody. And America begins to industrialize. And we have railroads and steamboats that are running on oil, and we're like getting really powerful. Well, John D Rockefeller, his oil company, he becomes the richest man in the world. You know how he did it? He would sell his oil. Well, he made an under-the-table agreement with the railroads to ship his oil cheaper than his competitors. And then he would sell it cheaper and put his competitors out of business. And once they were all out of business, he had a monopoly. He would raise the price of oil through the roof and give a kickback to the railroads. And he did this over and over and over again until he became the richest man in the world. And so, that's the Standard Oil Company. What did he do with this oil money? He was controlling all kinds of different things in our country. Then in 1908, oil is discovered in the Ottoman Empire, in the Middle East, in Kirkuk, and in Afghanistan, or Kirkuk, which is the Kurds area, and then in Baghdad. The geologists pretended like they were archaeologists, like they were wanting to look at old things, but they were actually studying the rock formations, and they discovered this oil. Suddenly, this Ottoman Empire, which would have collapsed, now is this apple that all the European powers want. Because they want to get online and have their railroads and steamboats and so forth, but they need oil, and now all of a sudden the Middle East is a player in this world political chessboard. So there's the first oil well in the Middle East, Iraq oil. And then there was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Right? So now you have England having an interest in this oil there in the Middle East. It's incorporated in 1909. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was renamed the British Petroleum Company in 1954. The third largest global energy company, headquarters in London, England, and Pakistan, Islamabad, Karachi, and so today it's BP. Anyway, I like this sign. So here they are taking down the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company sign, and they're putting up the British Petroleum, so it's BP. So Winston Churchill talked the British Navy into not running on coal, but on oil. And where did they get the oil? From the Middle East, from this Anglo-Iranian oil company. But Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, he's now wanting to be a player, and he runs a railroad across Eastern Europe, across the Bosporus, across Turkey, all the way into Mosul to Baghdad. And he is now beginning to flex his muscles. The British had to take all their oil by ship. And now he's got a land route with this railroad. And so there's the railroad. If you've seen the movie The Promise with Christian Bale, it's going through this period of the Kaiser Wilhelm's men coming and meeting with the Sultan and doing this deal to drive out all the other powers and put up this railroad, and it ties into the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe. Now it's trying to get another breath, and they're wanting to, what they call Ottomanization. To restore their Ottoman Empire to glory, they decided they wanted one language, one culture, and one religion. And so to regain their big strength, they want to drive out anybody that doesn't speak their language and other cultures and other religions. And so they began to wipe out the Syrian and the Armenian Christian communities. They had been minorities for centuries, and they lived as second-class citizens, very similar to the way the freed slaves were treated in the Democrat South. Right? Lincoln, Republican, freed the slaves. Democrats in the South passed Jim Crow laws and black codes. So the blacks had to live as second-class citizens in the Democrat South. Right? And it's a terrible chapter in American history, but it's an adequate description of how the Christians lived for centuries under Muslim governments. They were these minorities, and they were on thin ice all the time. Well, what happened was, with this Ottomanization, it's no longer living as second-class citizens. It's, we want to get rid of you. And they killed 1.5 million Armenian Christians between 1915 and 1922 for no other purpose than just to kill them all. And anyway, there's the Baghdad Railroad from Germany. Here's the Kaiser Wilhelm, and here's the Sultan, and they built like some pillar and fountain to dedicate their union there. And so half of World War I took place in the Middle East. And they used poison gas in Europe, trench warfare, World War I. They used poison gas in the Middle East. And here's some books, First World War in the Middle East, Eden to Armageddon. There's they're on camels and horses and so forth. So, Woodrow Wilson, he wanted America, number one, to fight in World War I and win, and we did. But then he wanted America to come to the rescue of the Armenians. It was going to be the first act of the League of Nations. And the irony is, it was a good thing, rescuing these Armenian Christians. But the League of Nations was this deal that meant America had to surrender its sovereignty to this international ruling body. And obviously we said no. So we did not join the League of Nations, and as a result, we did not come to the rescue of the Armenians. And so the Turks have 3 Turkish generals. They have a sort of a staged coup, and they get rid of Abdul Hameed. He's chased out to France. So there's no more Sultan. And there's this brief euphoria in Turkey, very similar to when Saddam Hussein was driven out. And Iraq thought, we're going to have a constitution. We get to vote. Remember, we dip our finger in the ink and we vote. And so there was this brief period where people in Iraq actually thought that they were going to be another civilized country. But what happened was, it was just a ploy for power people to grab hold. So when they got rid of Abdul Hameed in Turkey, these 3 Turkish generals seized power. And they're called the Young Turks and the Pashas. And they were really deceitful. So what did they do? They took advantage of this enthusiasm, and they told the Armenian communities that for the first time in centuries, the Armenian young men can join the Turkish military. And so these young men are like, yeah, I get, and you know, right? And but after all the young Armenian men are in the military, they decide that they're going to make them non-combatant soldiers. You'll still be a soldier, you'll still have rank and everything, but you just won't carry a gun. And they would give them road assignments and, you know, all kinds of chopping down trees and, you know, hauling stuff and all these, you know, sort of manual labor type things. And then they wouldn't feed them. And then they would have them march through snow 4 feet deep. And then they would tell some Muslim village that there's a bunch of emaciated Kafir infidels, and the whole village would empty out and kill them all. And even the housewives would take a butcher knife to go out and kill an infidel, right? Because they want to get a little guarantee of paradise there. And so once all the young Armenian men were killed, and there's some sad stories, like there's one where they said, okay, we're going to have you go from this city to this city. And the soldier said, no. And they go to the archbishop and they said, look, all we're going to do is just move from this city to that city. We promise, promise, promise. And so he goes to the soldier and says, well, look, they told me that she's going to move from one city to the other. As soon as they got out of the city, they kill them all. And so the ambassador from America to Turkey, his name was Morgenthau, he begins to report on all this. And that's who works into that movie that Christian Bale was in called The Promise. Anyway, so they kill these 1.5 million Armenian Christians between 1915 and 1922. Teddy Roosevelt's going around America giving speeches for us to come to their aid, and we do nothing. And anyway, horrible tragedy. When Hitler was asked how he thought he could get away with killing the Jews, he goes, the world did nothing when the Turks killed all those Armenians. They're not going to do anything when I killed the Jews. But all these groups were started for Armenian, to come to their aid, but we don't. They would march them off of cliffs. They would march them through the deserts. I've got a friend of mine, Cynthia Davis, was a Missouri State Representative. I spoke at fundraisers for her. When they were doing the Kelo decision, taking private land so that they could build stuff and tax on it. The Bush family, August Bush, they had a whole bunch of Great River land that they didn't want the city to take and take it from them. And so I actually had the fundraiser at their house. I was in the Bush mansion, right, with Ulysses S. Grant stuff and buffalo heads everywhere. I'm on the big grand staircase. Anyway, so Cynthia Davis, her maiden name is Gashgorian, and she's Armenian. And she and her family were all there. And I'm visiting with them. And they're talking about how the one aunt was pregnant, and on the forced march, she gives birth. And they make her abandon the baby in a ditch and just march on, right? And she was like so traumatized, she never married, never had kids after that. And other ones would fall dead, and they would dangle food out in front of them. If they reached for the food, they'd chop their arms off. I mean, unbelievable. For one Baptist pastor, I was talking to him, his mother was a young woman, and she was pregnant, and the dad takes her down to the dock and has her get in an empty pickle barrel, puts the lid on it, rolls it up, and bribes one of the Muslim guys to put this barrel on that boat, don't ask any questions. And so he does, and she gets off, she gets across the Mediterranean, they land in France, and she gets out, and then she eventually comes to America. So, heartbreaking stories of the Armenian genocide, and nobody in the world was going to stop them. So World War I ends. And you know how they took a map of Europe and they redraw the borders of countries? And they actually created countries like Yugoslavia. Right? They mix a little bit of the Serbs and Croatians and Bosnians. They create these different countries. Well, they did the same thing in the Middle East. And they created countries. And they took the map and and would divvy it all up as to France is going to get a little part, Russia's going to get a little part, Italy, right? And so this was the general map. The French mandate was Syria. France was going to get Turkey, but they sort of rally and keep their independence with Ataturk. The British have Palestine, and then what becomes Iraq, and there's Iran and Arabia. Now, throwing a monkey wrench into their map dividing up plan is Lawrence of Arabia. Who was he? He was a British lieutenant, and he was sent on an assignment to see if the Arab Muslims could be organized to fight the Turkish Muslims. We got a couple different kind of Muslims. And he was just supposed to report back. He takes it upon himself to promise the Arabs that if they will help the British fight the Turks, they will get all the land that used to be the Turkish Empire. And so now we have the land, the same land, being divvied up two different ways. One, the European powers that fought over there, over the taking claim, and two, these Arabs that Sir Lawrence of Arabia promised them that if they would help, they would get the land. In his 7 Pillars of Wisdom book in 1922, Lawrence of Arabia wrote this: I risked the fraud on my conviction that Arab help was necessary to our cheap and speedy victory in the East. And better we win and break our word than lose. He knew he was lying to these guys. Yet today, that is what the Palestinians place their claim to, that they should be getting the land of Israel. They go back to Lawrence of Arabia's unauthorized promise. So, same land, promised to two different groups. Now, we look at one of the Arabs that helped defeat the British, and his name is Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashimi. We'll just shorten it to al-Hashimi. And he is the Sharif and Emir of Mecca. So he's sort of like the #1 guy in Arabia. He's they didn't have a president or king, but he's like the Sharif. So that's the ruling family, and he's the main ruler. And the British like him because he helped them defeat the Turks. And here's Lawrence of Arabia. They did a movie about him. And so while they're dividing up the land, the British decide that some of the land that they divide up, they're going to call Transjordan, or on the other side of the Jordan River, Transjordan, and they're going to make one of al-Hashimi's the king, and his name is Abdul. And they take another one of al-Hashimi's sons, Fazl, and they make him the king of a brand new country called Syria and Iraq. And so these kings, like England, because England is the one who defeated the Ottoman Empire, and England's the one that gave them their country. So we have Muslim leaders in the Middle East that like Britain and like the West. Now, if I can throw another little ingredient into the mix, during World War I, the British were running short on explosives. And one of the necessary ingredients for explosives was acetone. And they were running short until a Jew who had immigrated from Russia, remember Fiddler on the Roof, and the Jews were driven out of Russia, and so some of them went to England, and this is one that went to England. His name was Chaim Weizmann. He's a Jewish chemist. And he makes a breakthrough in synthesizing the needed solvent of acetone by a bacterial fermentation process. And now that they have the acetone, they can make the explosives, and basically Britain has an unlimited supply of explosives now, and they can be really powerful militarily. And so they're indebted to Chaim Weizmann. After the war, they were going to make him a sir or a knight and give him an estate. And he told the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Baltimore, that he was interested in a homeland for the Jewish people. It was the Zionist movement and so forth. And Lord Balfour says, well, we can give you Uganda. The British control Uganda. Yeah, we'll give that. You can envoy to go to Uganda. And Chaim Weizmann was like, I was sort of thinking of the traditional land. And so, in gratitude, Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the British Foreign Minister, Lord Balfour, issued the Balfour Declaration, November 2nd, 1917, 100 years ago, just a month or two back, establishing a Jewish homeland in the former Turkish land controlled by the British. Are you following me okay? And here's the letter. There's Lord Balfour. And he writes, Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration, sympathy of the Jewish Zionist aspirations submitted to you. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So, this land used to be Turkish, the stick man of Europe. They sided with Kaiser Wilhelm when the Kaiser lost, the Ottoman Sultan, the Turks lost. And they divided up Europe, they divided up the Middle East, and the British control this area, and they're going to give part of it to the Jews. And Lord Balfour addresses a Jewish gathering. He says, my personal hope is that the Jews will make good in Palestine and eventually found a Jewish state. It is up to them now. We have given them their great opportunity. Here is Chaim Weizmann and King Faisal, the son of Al-Hashimi, and they're sort of friends. And the movie, Lawrence of Arabia, portrays King Faisal, and Alec Guinness is the actor. Now, you know Alec Guinness, because he was also Obi-Wan Kenobi. Star Wars, anyway. So, King Faisal, the son of Al-Hashimi, he writes in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference, we feel that the Arabs and Jews are cousins, and having suffered similar oppressions at the hands of powers stronger than themselves. We look with the deepest sympathy on the Zionist movement. We will wish the Jews a most hearty welcome home. So here you have the king of Syria and Iraq, who's put in there by the British, and he's welcoming the Jews, who are also getting their permission to come back by the British. And so this is the whole land, and the British and French mandate. So that's France and that's British. Now, if we zero in on this part here, it was all the British mandate. Originally, the Jews were going to get all of it. And the cry was brought that there needed to be a homeland for the Palestinian people. Now, they didn't call them Palestinian people because there was no Palestinian nation or Palestinian language or Palestinian food or Palestinian dress. There was no Palestinian national entity ever. Right? The name was what the Romans gave that area after they drove the Jews out, and they went back and pulled out the old Philistine name. And Josephus says that the Romans changed the name of Jerusalem to Capitolina Jupiter. They wanted to erase the presence of the Jews there. They forbade Jews from coming within sight of the city of Jerusalem. If they did, they would get killed. And then the Romans killed about 1 million Jews in their celebrations. You know, like Colosseum type of things. Hey, bring on the... And anyway, so the British decided to split the land that they were going to give to the Jews in half. And now, if you realize this was Al-Hashimi's son's Faisal's land, and at the same time, France is taking over some of Faisal's land that they weren't supposed to. And so Faisal's now thinking he's going to get into a war with France. And Britain says, look, don't get into a war with France over that part of Syria. Tell you what, we'll give this part to your brother. And so that's when Abdullah becomes the king of Transjordan, while Faisal is still the king of Iraq, and the dad, Al-Hashimi, is still the Sharif or Emir of Arabia. Here is King Abdullah, the new king of Transjordan, or Jordan, and there's Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill basically was the one who picked him out. And so the British were like, we sort of decide, when you're on the top of you play King of the Hill, when you're on the top of the hill, you sort of think you're always going to be there. You don't realize that it's just a moment in time that you get that position, and then afterwards you're sort of gone. And so that was when Winston Churchill, but the UK, France, Greece, and Italy, they all attempted to get a hold of Turkey, because the Ottoman Empire is pretty much gone, and they're all making inroads. And that's when Ataturk, Ata means father and Turk, so he's the father of modern-day Turkey, Ataturk. Ataturk rallies the Turkish people, and they are able to keep their home base. And UK, France, Greece, and Italy are sort of driven out. There's Ataturk there, and there's Ataturk. And he is friends with King Faisal. And what does he do? He wants to be friends with the West. You see, what happened was, when the Ottoman Empire fell, it had been the defender of Islam. It had the Sultan. And when it fell, it was a blow to the gut of the Muslim world. And they felt like not just did the Ottoman Empire fall, but everything they've been taught, all their Islamic teachings, everything, it all was gone. Sort of like Japan after the atomic bomb was dropped. They thought, not only did our emperor let us down, but our Shinto religion let us down, and everything let us down. We're open to the West. Okay, come in, tell us what you want to believe, right? And so the Muslim world wanted to become like the West. And here is Ataturk, and there's King Faisal. And they're both dressed in Western clothes, right? They're no longer wearing the Arab outfits. They got, clean shaven and so forth. And here's Ataturk. He looks like a 1920s Hollywood movie star. And he decides he wants to secularize Turkey. No more of the Sultan whipping the people up to do a holy war and killing all kinds of people that don't go along with it. And Ataturk says he is a weak ruler who needs religion to uphold his government. Even before accepting the religion of the Arabs, the Turks were a great nation. So they viewed the Islam as an Arab foreign importation. Ataturk said Mohammedanism was based on Arab nationalism above all nationalities. He says the purpose of the religion founded by Muhammad over all nations was to drag them into including Arab national politics. It might have suited tribes in the desert. It is no good for a modern progressive state. So here he is saying, look, all of this chopping off arms and legs, all this stuff, it may have suited tribes in the desert. It's no good for a modern progressive state. So Ataturk decided to outlaw the Arabic language. Had everybody speak Turkish. He outlawed Arabic names. He made them take Turkish names. He changed the end of the week from Friday, the Muslim holy day, to Saturday and Sunday, so they could more assimilate with Europe. He had the men get rid of their beards and had them wear Western clothes, and he gets rid of the burqas. And he has women go to school and get educated. This is like a big deal. He is like really pushing the envelope. And so he's in charge from 1924 to 1938, and he is making headroads in to secularizing the country. And he is still very popular in Turkey today. And everywhere you go, from the airports to the railroad stations, you will see pictures of Ataturk. He's sort of like their George Washington. And I'm glad. Now, Erdogan, I'll talk about him in a little bit. He is the new leader of Turkey. He does not like Ataturk. And he wants to re-Islamify Turkey. And he just, even last month, decided that it's okay to have child brides again. And so, let's look at Iran. Iran has sort of a coup, and one guy's thrown out, and the Shah gets in. And he is wanting to secularize Iran. And he becomes friends with our country. Matter of fact, Iran was so pro-American, believe it or not, it was actually more pro-American than Israel. Iran was pro-American all the way. So here's the Shah with Eisenhower. Here's the Shah with Harry S. Truman. Here's the Shah with John F. Kennedy. And there's the Shah and his wife, and Kennedy and Jacqueline. There's the Shah and his wife. And this is Iran in the 1970s. I mean, this goes... I went to college with an Iranian student, and he actually had an American flag on his dorm room wall. I hate to say it, in college, I didn't even have an American flag on my dorm room wall, right? And I met the Shah's son, right? Back when he lived in Maryland, and he loves America. And again, Iran, 1970s, looks like Southern California. And look at that, there's Iran. This is Kabul, Afghanistan. And here are these girls dressed like any college campus in America. Everybody is wanting to be like the West, right? They have mountains of useless sand, and, camels in the West has airplanes, telephones, televisions, all kinds of advancement. The future is the West. They would send their kids to Western schools. They would teach English in their countries. Here is Herbert Hoover with the king of Egypt. Egypt. Now, his name was King Fuad. He changed it from using the word Sultan or Caliph to king because king is a Western name. But he was a lush. In other words, he had a huge pornography collection. And he would go over to Europe and he would pig out at their dinners and he would eat 300 oysters at a time. And he actually died gagging on oysters at some dinner. And so there's a new leader in Egypt. His name's Gamal Nasser. And here's his family. They look like any American family. And he wanted to secularize Egypt. This is Egypt, 1960s. Looks like the Beach Boys. Right? Doesn't look like Southern California. Look at the swimsuits, This is Cairo, Egypt in the 1960s and 70s. And there's Nasser. And there's the streets of Cairo. And then in 1958, at a political meeting, Nasser says, I met the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he sat with me and made his request. What did he request? To make wearing the hijab mandatory in Egypt and demand that every woman walking the street wear a tarha scarf. Audience laughter. I told him my opinion is that every person in his own house decides for himself the rules. And he replied, no, as the leader, you are responsible. I told him, sir, you have a daughter in school of medicine. She is not wearing a tarha. If you are unable to make one girl, who is your daughter, wear the tarha, you want me to put a tarha on 10 million women? Myself, sustained laughter. So here we have leaders of these Muslim countries wanting to westernize themselves and become friends with the West. What happened? How do we go from Iran in the 1970s to Iran today? Well, remember al-Hashimi in Arabia? The Sharif, he's the one who helped the British defeat the Turks. His son, Abdullah, is the king of Jordan. His son, Fazl's the king of Iraq. The British wanted to do a treaty, and he waffles on the treaty. And the British say, well, you know what? We're just going to sort of withdraw from helping you. Well, in the meantime, the Saud family teams up with the Wahhabi. Now, the Wahhabis were this fundamentalist group started in 1740, and they were wanting to bring back this fundamental Muslim rule. They wanted the caliphate, which is the whole Muslim world under one leader called a caliph. And the Wahhabis were into cutting off arms and legs and having harems, and they'd have their tents in the desert. And they were just a fringe desert group that was viewed as a heresy amongst the rest of the Muslims. It was viewed as this fringe, crazy group. Well, as the British are standing back from al-Hashimi, the Wahhabs and the Sauds conquer a little village here, a little outlying village there, a little outlying village there, and then in 1924 they capture Mecca. Now, why is that significant? Well, let me just read a quote here first. Here's Lawrence of Arabia, Seven Pillars of Wisdom. The Wahhabis followers of a fanatical Muslim heresy, had imposed their strict rules. Everything was forcibly pious or forcibly puritanical. So Lawrence of Arabia says, they're a Muslim heresy. So, once the Saud and Wahhabis capture Mecca, Mecca is where the Hajj is. You know the 5 pillars of Islam that they now teach in our public school system?
Yeah.
The last 5th one is once in your life you're supposed to take a pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, Muslims from around the world going on their pilgrimage are getting infected with the Wahhabi, violent, fundamentalist version of Islam and going back to their countries. But Arabia is still a mountain of sand. There's nothing there. And so it's not a prize like, Baghdad or these other areas. And so England sort of says, do whatever you want in this desert. But then, oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia in 1938 by Standard Oil Company. You remember Standard Oil Company was run by John D Rockefeller, the richest man in the world. John D Rockefeller, son David Rockefeller, right? And they controlled Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, the Rockefeller Foundation, J.P. Morgan, Chase Bank. David Rockefeller started the Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission, big globalist groups, and they give the land for the UN building. And so now we have this globalist Rockefeller and his company discovering oil in Saudi Arabia. And they actually let them keep the money from it, but they insist that they deposit the money into their banks. And then with fractional reserve banking, where all they have to do is keep a very small portion of the money in the bank can lend out the rest of it and make interest on it. And lend it out again, make more interest, lend it out again, so they can multiply the money that's deposited. And anyway. So, Saudi Arabia, in one generation, goes from the poorest Muslim country to the richest Muslim country. And they become a magnet for Wahhabi, fundamental Islamic influence that they're now spreading around the world. And so Saudi Arabia has been the #1 builder of mosques, #1 publisher of Islamic textbooks. They're building mosques all across Africa, all across Romania, and all across Bulgaria, all across Europe, and in America.
Yes.
And the statistics I've read said 9 out of 10 mosques are being funded by Saudi Arabia through all kinds of different groups. And they buy politicians. Right, Democrat and Republican. Why? Because you need money to get elected, and they got lots of money. I thought it was interesting. Trump did not go to England because he was upset that Obama had signed the deal on selling the American embassy, and they're going to build this new embassy. Well, lo and behold, the Obama administration had that former U.S. embassy in London on the prime spot, right in downtown, sold to some Muslims to build a big hotel. And anyway. So here they are building their pipeline across Arabia. And now the Wahhabis inspired all kinds of different fundamentalist groups. ISIS, Salafi, Taliban, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Hezbollah, Al-Shabaab, Muslim Brotherhood. The name changes, but their goal is the same. They want a caliphate. They want a religious, political, military system that does not just get back all of the Ottoman Empire. They want it to go global. And they want the whole world. Islam has this concept that when your enemy is strong, retreat. When your enemy is weak, attack. And so when the Western world shows itself strong, they go into a remission mode. And when the Western world shows itself weak, they take that as an indicator from Allah that they're supposed to get aggressive again. And so the dilemma is when the West teaches itself to be really nice and friendly and don't offend them and be really careful to not offend them, the fundamental Muslims view that niceness as weakness, and they take that as an indicator from Allah that they're supposed to attack. Right? When your enemy is strong, retreat. When your enemy shows weakness, attack. It's sort of the law of nature, the law of the jungle. So the Muslim Brotherhood was started in Egypt in 1928. They make it really clear. Allah is our objective, the Quran is our constitution, the Prophet is our leader, jihad is our way, death for the sake of Allah is the highest of our aspirations. They infiltrate the Egyptian military. So after Nasser, you have Sadat, and he is having a parade. And Mubarak, his vice president, is with him. And the military is marching in front. The Muslim Brotherhood, who had infiltrated the military, stop in front of the bandstand, turn their guns, and fire their machine guns and kill the president of the country, Sadat. Mubarak's injured, but he survives. And so America is now propping up Mubarak to try to crack down on these fundamentalist Muslims because they'll infiltrate. They'll pretend like they're one thing, but then once they get in, they do something else. Now this says the Quran is our constitution. Here's a couple verses from the Quran. When you meet the infidel on the battlefield, strike off their head. Prophet make war on the infidels, kill the disbeliever. And so they've infiltrated these different countries, and they use the two phases of Muhammad's life as their example. I'll get into it in the second half, because we'll take a break here for a minute. Muhammad he's chased out of the city of Mecca, and Muhammad has nowhere to go. He's like a Muslim refugee. And he goes to the city of Medina, and the Jews control the city of Medina, and they let Muhammad in as an immigrant. And Muhammad goes into the minority neighborhoods, and he begins to organize a following amongst these people who have grievances against the Jewish government. Right? We're familiar with the term of organizing in the community. Yeah. And when the following gets big enough, Muhammad and his followers go to the Jews and pressures the Jews to accommodate him and his followers. And the Jews cave, and they do, and now they make a treaty. And so Muhammad is a political leader in Medina as well as a religious leader. When Muhammad's followers are chased out of Mecca, they're Muslim refugees. They come into Medina, and Muhammad allows them to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing him out of town. So where Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt, Muhammad's attitude was, if they take your house and chase you out of town, you retaliate, take their caravan. And so Muhammad has 300 warriors, they rob caravans, kills 3,000 people, and within 5 years of Muhammad coming as an immigrant into the Jewish city of Medina, there's not a Jew left in the city of Medina. He had 700 of them beheaded. Right? And so it's this process: immigrate, increase, eliminate. Immigrate as a religious refugee into a host country, increase the number of your followers and begin to demand political accommodation, and then have random outbreaks of violence that drive out the former inhabitants of the neighborhood. Right? And so, based on this, now, are all Muslims like that? No, but the Muslim Brotherhood kind are. And so, the idea is that they first come into these host countries just as religious refugees. But then, when the signal is given, is when they transition to the political military and they become aggressive and they overthrow the governments. Remember, we called it an Arab Spring. They're overthrowing all these governments. Now, what's the signal of when they switch? When the enemy shows weakness. So when we bend over backwards and we think if we're just a little bit nicer, they'll reciprocate and become nice. They see us bending over backwards, showing our neck, and they say, look, Allah's given us our enemies. Wow. Right? And anyway. So we have Jerusalem. And they have a Muslim leader there named the Mufti. Mufti of Jerusalem. And he meets with Hitler. You know what Hitler was going to do? He was going to send all the Jews from Germany and the Czech Republic, he was going to send them all to Palestine. Right? The Jews were going there already, and he was just going to send them there. This Mufti of Jerusalem says, we don't want them, kill them. And so that's when Hitler does his final solution. And anyway, so the Mufti raises an entire Bosnian Panzer division of Muslims to fight alongside of Hitler. And when Hitler was finally killed in April of 1945 in Berlin, they found there were 100 Muslims in the Arab Legion that were guarding his bunker. And so we see this. Now, after the end of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt goes to the Yalta Conference with Churchill and Stalin. And the story was, Roosevelt's style of politics was to have a couple of drinks, buddy up, and hey, let's, Stalin was like iron knuckles, and he's like, get him drunk, Anyway, Roosevelt lets Stalin take a map and just cut half of Europe and make it communist. It's like, What was he doing? This is like 2 months before Roosevelt dies. What was he in the position? He should have done it. Anyway, on his way back to that terrible situation, the Yalta Conference, Roosevelt stops off on the USS Quincy in the Suez Canal, and he meets with the Saudi king of Arabia. Why? Oh, well, he was going to talk the Arabs into helping the Jews get resettled into the promised land after World War II. This king of Arabia slaughters a goat on deck for their food to barbecue, and he just blindsides FDR, saying the Jews are terrible, they're horrible, and FDR doesn't know how to respond. And he gets back to Washington, and there's a couple letters sent back and forth, and one of the letters, FDR says, this was like April 7th or whatever, 1945. He says, as long as I'm president, you can be assured that America will not recognize Israel as a nation. 1 week later, FDR finally dies. And Harry S. Truman takes over, and one of the first things he does is recognize Israel as a nation. And anyway, there's the Saudi oil fields, and there's the Saudi Arabians figuring out how to work a gas pump. I was talking with Rick Perry a couple years ago, and he was in the Air Force, and he was stationed over there. And he says that you had to watch out because they were just driving all over the place, And but they went in one generation from camels to Cadillacs, gold Cadillacs, and they became this magnet for fundamentalism. So the rest of the Muslim world said, why should we be more secular like the West to be blessed? Let's be more fundamental like Saudi Arabia to be blessed. So here they are, the richest Muslim country, but the most fundamentalist Muslim country, where they still have Riyadh, Deira Square, where they chop off arms and legs. Look at the city, isn't that amazing? And that's Riyadh. And so in Riyadh, they still have Chop Chop Square, where every week they chop off arms and legs and stone women to death. I talked to a soldier that was stationed over there, and he said, yeah, if an American is in the crowd, they push him to the front. And he goes, I witnessed a woman getting stoned to death. They're still doing it. But yet, they're so wealthy, the other Muslim countries are drawn to it as a magnet. Anyway, there's Jimmy Carter, and he betrays the Shah and allows the fundamentalist Muslims to take over Iran. And anyway, 1971, we're tired of Vietnam, and we stand back while the Muslims killed 2.5 million Hindus, and Kissinger and Nixon do nothing. And then Reagan, I love him, in 1983, when they blew up the Marine barracks in Lebanon, his response was to withdraw. So again, we're showing weakness. When your enemy is strong, you retreat, but when your enemy is weak, attack. And now the enemy, we're retreating. So they're taking this as a signal from Allah that they're supposed to get aggressive. Anyway, I'm going to pause and turn it back over to Andy for a second, and then I'm going to pick up and bring it up to current times. And are you getting anything out of this?
Yeah.
Is it interesting? Does it help answer some questions and fill in some of the little slots? And I think it really helps us to plot our future when we know where we all came from. Ally in Egypt, Obama fires him. Gets on the phone and says, you're out, right? And then Obama sends his community organizers over there, and they overthrow and put in a Muslim Brotherhood leader named Morsi. And for a year, he's fundamentalizing the country, and, driving tanks into crowds of Christians as they come out of a church and just mowing them down and all stuff. And miracle of miracles, 26 million Egyptians gather in Tahrir Square, and they throw out the Muslim Brotherhood leader that President Obama put in, named Morsi. And they say, look, yeah, we're more cultural Muslim, and we don't like that fundamentalist kind of Muslim. Right? So Zubi Jasser is a friend of mine, and he reminds me of this. He goes, not all Muslims are the fundamentalist kind. And so here they are holding up these signs, and they said, we don't like Obama, we don't like Erdogan, we don't like terrorism. And now another ingredient in the Syrian war is oil. So there is, again, remember, oil is what brought the Middle East into European politics to begin with. We had the whale, we had oil in America from Pennsylvania and Oklahoma, and all of Europe wanted oil. And so they have pipelines that are there and proposed pipelines. So Russia's #1 export is oil and gas to Europe. And so it doesn't really want to get any new sources of oil and gas to Europe. Well, Arabia is wanting to have a Qatar-Turkish pipeline. So it'll start in Qatar and go through Syria, go through Turkey, and into Europe. And this will cut off the Russian oil supply. So here's the Syrian Asian Times. Writing for Armed Forces Journal, Major Rob Taylor joined numerous other pundits in observing that the Syrian civil war is actually a pipeline war over control of energy supply, with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey needing to remove Assad so they can control Syria and run their own pipeline through Turkey. Because Assad is friends with Russia. There's another article. It's the guy stupid. It says, Harvard professor Mitchell Ornstein, George Romer wrote, Foreign Affairs, Russia currently supplies Europe with a quarter of the gas. 80% of the gas is from Russian state-controlled company Gazprom. Russia, which uses its power over gas as political leverage, doesn't want any new pipelines to go through. Right? So, 2 points that changed it from this secularization of Ataturk, the Shah, Nasser, and, girls looking like American girls in Kabul, Afghanistan. What changed it are the two things. One, the Wahhabi fundamentalist religion, which was this lurking belief from the 1700s of this cutting off arms and legs. They have the harems and so forth, but they team up with the Wahhabis, with the Saud family, and they conquer Arabia and give birth to all these fundamentalist groups. But the second is Saudi oil. And that is what changed. Now, it's important for us to stand back and look at trends in history. And one of the trends we see is Europe went from a Judeo-Christian Europe, right? It had Catholic cathedrals, Protestant Reformation, Jewish neighborhoods. And then it went into a secular Europe with French Revolution. Voltaire, Robespierre, Napoleon spreading all this French secularism all around Europe, and Europe became secular. And secular says, hey, nothing special about our Christian past, anything you can bring in. And you bring in this belief, that belief, and you bring in Islam. And so what happens is the whole secular, gay, LGBT, transgender, all that is a transition phase. It's a creative way to cut ties with the Christian past, but it's quickly co-opted by fundamental Islam. And so we see Europe went from drive, neutral, reverse. It goes from a Judeo-Christian past, secular, free sex, anything goes neutral, and now Europe is becoming Islam. So Muhammad is the #1 name given to newborns in London, Milan, Brussels. There's 751 neighborhoods around Paris. They've completely surrounded the city of Paris, and 5 million Muslims. And they put up, the best the police can do is put up signs. It says ZUS, Zonas Urbanas Sensibles, Sensitive Urban Zone. In other words, if you go in there as a lady and you're not covered, you'll get raped and there's no witnesses. Because no Muslim's going to testify against another Muslim on behalf of a kafir infidel. Right? So it's sort of a no man's land. And so they're setting these up in Germany. Angela Merkel bringing in all these Muslims, and whole areas, they're protesting Christmas decorations. And so these neighborhoods are like, okay, no more Christmas decorations. And they're protesting this, okay, they're just caving. And the Muslim men can have multiple wives. And it's a social stigma for a Muslim woman to have less than 5 kids. And what they do is they figured out the system where they can have a wife in an apartment, and she goes down to the welfare office and says the husband's not around. And she gets checks. And he has another wife in another apartment, another wife, another wife, another wife. And so the man just goes and visits the wives, and they have more and more kids, and he collects the checks, and the men are living like kings off of state expense. And they're having all these kids, and the Europeans have bought into overpopulation, global warming, and all this stuff, and they're maybe having 1 kid per couple. Many of them aren't even having that, right? And so, demographically, in 20 years, Europe will be Muslim. And now the average Muslim person just wants to live their lives and have their family, and they're content to coexist with non-Muslims. But there's this small minority that are being reawakened to the fundamentalist Wahhabi version, and they're the ones that commit terrorist attacks, and they're getting radicalized.
And now the dilemma is, when we are very careful not to identify the source, the fundamental Islam, and we call it terrorism, or we call it workplace violence, or whatever, that's a signal of weakness. And when they can, behead and so forth, and so we're sending a signal that's actually helping to recruit more Muslims to the radicals. It's sending the signal that, yes, the kafir infidel world is laying down before us, and Allah is giving them to us. And so the fundamentalist ones are the ones that do the Boston bombings, and the Ohio State knifings, and the beheadings in Oklahoma, and the Fort Hood shootings, and the San Bernardino killings, and the Orlando gay nightclub killings, and the mall killings in Burlington, Washington, and the Istanbul terrors, and the Paris attacks. And you know that one Muslim that blew up people after a concert in England? Remember that story? And he had told his grandmother, "Why should I settle for earthly women when I can have heavenly beauties?" So what happens is he goes to a lustful concert, gets all his lust stirred up, and then he thinks, I'm one push away from having a really good time, right? And so it's a very powerful motivator for men. We even use something that says sex sells because we realize that it's a motivator for selling stuff. Well, it's a combination of human motivations. Religious fervor and lust. Who would have thought that you could have combined those? But it's a very powerful source of motivation. The fundamentalist ones are doing the Boko Haram in Nigeria. All right, so the British colonized Nigeria. And the British decided to give Nigeria... The British found that Muslims were better at collecting taxes than the Christians. So what did the British do? They put the Muslims in all the government positions. And so when Britain gives Nigeria its independence, it leaves the Muslims in charge. And so the Muslims in northern Nigeria are turning a blind eye while the Boko Haram are killing off these Christian villages. And they're like, we just can't seem to find where those Boko Haram are. It's like, yeah, we don't believe it. Nigeria, mall killings, asset attacks. LA Times, Oscar-winning documentary, 2012, Saving Facebook's applied on over 150 asset attacks on women each year. Did you know last year there were over 400 asset attacks in London? Right? Remember, Muslim mayor says we got to get used to it. This is the new standard. And so they're even setting up on street corners watering stations, right? So that they'll pull up on a motor scooter, and if you're on another motor scooter at a stoplight, they'll throw acid in your face, and while you're screaming, they jump on your bike and ride away, and then you're like there, and trying to get somebody to stop to give you water, and your face gets eaten away. Also, spurned marriage proposals. So a Muslim man proposes to a English girl, and if she says no, he throws acid in her face. Female genital mutilation. And so they were doing this in Detroit. And it's unimaginable. I mean, if there's anything that would be demonic, it's got to be this. Yeah. And this is one good thing Session was doing, was cracking down. As FBI arrests Muslims during female genital mutilation clinic bust. And then now not the nice ones. Again, the majority of Muslims would just be content to live their lives. It's the fundamentalist ones that are spurring it on. Let me give an illustration. You got a neighborhood, yes?
One question. You indicated there's this groups of Muslims that are living on the Dole in Germany. Which category do you put them in? Are they the terrorists, or are they just...
No, they're fundamental, yeah. Yeah, and it's a brilliant system. I just believe it's a wrong system. But the way it's set up is the Muslims will immigrate into a country. And a lot of them want to get away from where they came from. And so they come, and the natural tendency is to gravitate, to get along with, to live with people that you have things in common with. And so they end up living together and forming a community. Once they get a community, the imam shows up. And the imam says, okay, now that we're here, we got to start following the book. And he says, ladies, don't wear that imais clothes anymore. And men, don't be close friends with infidels, and eat the halal food and not the haram food. And then, so when they start wearing the burqas, that's the first step in them moving into a more fundamental direction. And then they begin to want to push to have the host country cave and accommodate them. And then that's another encouragement. And then the next step is you actually have a Muslim young man that believes he's going to get a handful of women, and he commits random lone wolf acts of violence. And the non-Muslims move out. And then they end up taking over the neighborhoods. So these are churches that have existed from the time of the apostles. And within the last 8 years, under our president, they've been destroyed. And Iraq's oldest monastery, and churches where they would come in and just kill the Christians. And they destroyed the grave of Jonah. It existed from 700 BC. You know in the Bible, Jonah and Nineveh? His grave existed until just a couple of years ago, the ISIS Muslims destroyed it. And now, when these fundamentalist ones do these attacks, politicians are quick to assure us that these Muslim terrorists do not represent true Islam. But the terrorists are yelling Allahu Akbar, and they claim that they do represent fundamentalist true Islam. Who can tell us what true Islam is? One person, Muhammad. He was the best Muslim that ever lived. And so his life is called the Sunnah, which means the way or the example. And Muhammad's life went through 3 stages. I went through this before, but I'll recap it. First, he was religious, then he became political, then he became military. So, 610 AD, Muhammad is a religious leader in the pagan city of Mecca. He only makes 70 converts in 12 years. He gets confrontational. They chase him out of town. He has nowhere to go. He's a Muslim refugee. Tries to go to a city named Al-Taif. And they pelt him with rocks and stones, and the little kids cheer and throw dust at him, and he chases him out. Muhammad has nowhere to go. It's his year of sorrows, right? And so he is a Muslim refugee. That's when he goes to Medina as a Muslim immigrant. The Jews are nice and let him in. And he forms this little community of people that are against the Jewish government, forces the Jews to make a treaty, and now he's a political leader. And then you see the caravan routes, and he then allows his men to rob the caravans as they're headed to Mecca. And he gets a whole chapter of the Quran on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. It's chapter 8, Surah 8. And Muhammad gets 1/5 of the booty. And Allah tells him that he gets the slave girls as part of his booty. And so they attack the caravans. And this is the famous Battle of Badr in 624 AD. With 300 warriors, Muhammad defeats 1,000. And so he takes this as confirmation from Allah that he is supposed to be a military leader. And that's when he fights in 66 battles and raids, killing 3,000 people. He even used the catapult when he went to conquer the city of Al-Taif. And when they told him the catapult was hurling these rocks that were smashing and killing women and children, Muhammad's response was, they are among them, so they got to be killed too. So suicide bombers and ISIS killers say it's okay to kill innocent people to advance Islam because Muhammad did. And since he's the perfect Muslim, they want to be like him religiously, politically, and militarily. So it's an RPM, it's a threefold system. So there's freedom for all religions in America. But Islam is not just a religion. Because Muhammad was not just a religious leader. He was a political and a military leader. And so Islam is a religious system, a political system, and a military system. A mosque is a religious building, a political building, and a military building. Bowing to Mecca is a religious bowing, a political bowing, and a military pledging of allegiance to another capital. And our effort in the West to split the religious side of Islam away from the political military side is we're trying to split Muhammad. Who are we to split their prophet? He was all three, right? And so if we set aside the religious aspect of Islam, the political aspect is it operates in the same dynamics as a gang style. By the fact that in the gang you're free to join, but if you try to leave the gang gangs up on you and kills you, so you can't leave. Lessons of Tocqueville, Muhammad put into the Quran not religious doctrines only, but political maxims, criminal and civil law. So he's acknowledging it's not just religious, it's political, it's military. Now there's 2 sets of verses in the Quran based on the 2 cities Muhammad lived in. So in Mecca, he was a religious leader, and the verses are religious and a little more peaceful. In Medina are the political and military verses, and they're a little more violent. And the later verses supersede the earlier verses. By way of comparison, in the Bible, we have an Old Testament and a New Testament. Old Testament has some violence in it. Moses and Joshua wiping out tribes. New Testament, Jesus and the apostles never killed anyone. And so what do we say? Oh, the later example, the one we're going to try to follow, the more peaceful one. It's the same way it is, only in reverse. Their peaceful verses came first when Muhammad was a religious leader in Mecca, and they're superseded. They're called weak verses, and they're superseded by the later verses that come in Medina. They're called strong verses. So the last example Muhammad left was the political military example. They utilized a tactic called victimhood. So Muhammad, when he was in Mecca, and he was getting confrontational, he was insulting them for worshiping their pagan gods, and they had 360 different pagan gods. And they're like, look, we're really tolerant. We tolerate each other, and we tolerate you, but you're being too exclusive. And they decide to chase Muhammad out. And he says, I'm the victim. You are intolerant of me. Therefore, I'm justified in attacking you. And so we see this attitude used over and over again to play the victim. Right? So I'm the, and even to the effect, there was this one case, I think in Canada, where a young 11-year-old Muslim girl going to school, and she said that somebody had ripped her scarf. And so it sort of whips everybody into this frenzy that she's the victim. It only comes out later that she did it to herself to try to get, sympathy. And so this is an idea that they're justified to attack if they can claim that you were the victim. Now this is contrasting with Jesus. Jesus did not retaliate when he suffered. What did he do? Instead, he forgave. Matter of fact, Jesus tied your salvation with forgiving of offenses. Right? Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So it's just, right? And so if you harbor offenses, you're going to have all your offenses held against you. And so the Christian faith, one of the key principles of it is you cannot get offended. And if you do, you repent of it, because that's not the way Jesus was. Jesus was down on the cross, and he's forgiving the people that are doing it to him. So 627 AD, the Meccans sent 10,000 soldiers to Medina. Their caravans have been robbed now for 5 years, and they're marching toward Medina. Now it turns out Muhammad is a brilliant military leader. Primarily because he's creative, he's unconventional, he's unpredictable. He doesn't play by the rules of traditional Arab warfare. So these Arabs had 1 month off a year where they agreed not to fight. It was their pilgrimage month. They'd set aside their differences and go to that city of Mecca. There was a square building called the Kaaba, and it housed 360 different pagan gods. And they'd all sort of get along for this month. Muhammad gets verses from his Allah instructing him to rob the caravans during this month. And he catches them totally off guard and comes away with a lot of booty. And so these Meccans are marching toward Medina. Muhammad's version of roadside bombs was he dug potholes and trenches all around the city of Medina, which rendered the superior cavalry of the Meccans useless. You can't charge your horse and camel across a field full of potholes. They'll break their legs, so it throws off the battle strategy. So Muhammad goes to some of the pagan tribes at night and bribes them. They slip away. Goes to some of the other pagan tribes at night and he threatens them and they slip away. Sort of the Chicago politics, the bribe or the bullet, the silver or the lead. And so then it gets freezing cold for a week. The rest of the Meccans lose heart and retreat and go home. And the idea, when your enemy is strong, retreat. When your enemy is weak, attack. So when these Meccans retreated, Muhammad took this as an indicator he was supposed to attack. Goes back into that city of Medina. And remember those Jews that let him in 5 years earlier when he was a refugee? They were in 3 different Jewish groups or tribes. He gets offended at the first one, confiscates all their property, chases them out of town. And then he gets offended at the second Jewish tribe, confiscates their property, chases them out of town. This set a precedent in Islam called hudna, H-U-D-N-A, hudna. It means when you're weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard them. Right? And so here we are, we've been twisting Israel's arm to make a treaty with the Palestinians, when the Palestinian concept of a treaty is just a ceasefire to restock missiles, dig more tunnels. Or, Obama made a treaty with Iran, when the whole concept of a treaty is you only make the treaty when you're weak until you get strong enough to attack. So Muhammad bottles the third Jewish tribe in their neighborhood, and then he brings them into the market and chops off their heads. 700 of them. So within 5 years of Muhammad coming as an immigrant into a Jewish neighborhood, there is not a Jew left in the neighborhood. Within 5 years of Muhammad's death, every pre-existing culture in Arabia was wiped out. And we see that it's a three-step process, like Caesar's 3 steps, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Muhammad's 3 steps was immigrate, increase, eliminate. Immigrate as a religious refugee. Increase the number of your followers amongst disadvantaged minorities and people in the prison system and so forth. And then when you begin to demand political accommodation, and then you have random violence to drive out So just a couple of years ago, the Fox News reported, first U.S. majority Muslim city council warns today we show the Polish. So this is Hamtramck, Michigan. It was a Polish city. And the Muslims came in, and they grew in numbers, and now they voted in. And what did they say? They go, we're going to show the Polish. And so now they build these minarets, and they have their calls to prayer 5 times a day, beginning at like 4:30 in the morning. And they're driving the former Polish inhabitants out. And so there's a 1,400-year track record of Islamic expansion that uses this 3-step process, immigrate, increase, eliminate. And we're divided into 3 springs. There's an Arab-Persian spring from 622 to 1071. Then the Turks convert, and that's the whole Turkish Ottoman Empire that I started off with. And then the current Arab Spring started in 1928. Another tactic they use is psychological projection, or blame shifting. The attacker blames the victim. Sigmund Freud coined the term, where rude people have a tendency to call everybody else rude. Hateful people call everybody else hateful. Right? They'll even put up a website where they list everybody that they hate. And so this idea of blame shifting, where they'll come into a very tolerant community and then accuse their host of being intolerant, use themselves as the victim, and then they'll use that as an excuse to attack. So they would come up to a town, say, we offer you peace. If you want peace, submit to Islam. If you not submit, that means you don't want peace, and they wage war. And this contrasts with Jesus, who says, go to a town and preach the gospel. If they do not receive you, shake the dust from your feet and leave. Muhammad's idea was, go to a town, preach your message. If they don't receive you, wage war on the town. And their goal is what? To set up a one-world government, a global Sharia state called the Caliphate under a one leader called the Caliph. They wouldn't have been successful without the invention of the stirrup. Came from Mongolia, and came across the Gobi Desert. The Persians had it, but then the Muslims got it, and then the scimitar swords. Europeans are using these heavy metal swords, and Muslims have these curved, light scimitar swords. And there's the Supreme Court chamber, Washington, D.C., has Muhammad with a sword, and there's his sword. They still have his sword today in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, Turkey. On top of that hill where the Hagia Sophia is, there's this palace of the Sultan. And so we see Muhammad's general, Khalid ibn al-Walid, fought over 100 battles, and was victorious. He was called the Drawn Sword of Allah, and conquered Syria. And then here they conquered Yemen. It used to be a Jewish kingdom. Conquered Jerusalem, which was Christian. Remember Constantine's mom, St. Helena, built all these cathedrals in Jerusalem. The Muslims conquered Syria, and into Persia, and into Armenia, and then into Egypt. And there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses. And then they invade Spain. Christians of North Africa had embraced this pietism that said, if you really become a Christian, you should give away all your money and live in a cave. Right? Withdraw, and so as a result, Islam had no resistance, just swept right through. When the Muslims conquered Egypt, they held back the ships with papyrus, and so there's a paper shortage in Europe, leads to the Dark Ages. And then they destroy the oldest library in the world in Alexandria, Egypt. Supposedly the book's burned for 6 months. And anyway, I saw this just a couple years ago. ISIS militants raided the Central Library in Mosul, Iraq, to destroy all non-Islamic books. These books promote infidelity, call for disobeying Allah, announced a militant to the resident, so they will be burned. So they are wanting to do the same thing today that they did back in 642 AD when they burned that library in Cairo. And so then they conquer into Spain, and in 10 years they conquer all of Spain, cross the Pyrenees, and they finally stop for the Battle of Tours outside of Paris in 732 AD, just 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. They go from Arabia to Paris in a 100-year military campaign. And so since this is the first century of Islam, There are Muslims that look to this as their example, the way Christians look to the first century of Christianity and the early church as their example, right? And so it takes 7 centuries to drive them out of Spain. And then they come around and attack Constantinople. They're driven back by Greek fire, where they take oil and sawdust and sort of make a napalm out of it and spray it on these ships of the Muslims. Where Islam means submission to the will of Allah, Muslim is one who has submitted, and they think there'll be world peace when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. So Islam is a religion of peace. It's just their definition of the word peace is different than ours. Our definition of peace is different groups getting along. Their definition of world peace is world Islam. When the whole world submits to the will of Allah, there's peace. There's no way left to fight. Like Lincoln said, we all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. Right? And so in Islam, the world's divided in two. The half that's submitted and the half that's in the process of submitting. So they see the world as Muslim and going to be Muslim. The half that's submitted is the house of Islam, house of submission. The other is the Dar al-Harb, house of war. The non-Muslim world is supposed to be at war because it's in the process of submitting. A moderate Muslim thinks the world's going to submit to Allah later, maybe in the distant future, maybe at the end of the world, maybe it's even figurative in the sense it's so far off they really don't think about it, they just want to live their lives, have their family fun. Fundamental Muslim thinks the world's supposed to submit to Allah now, they're really excited, they want to help make it happen. Again, the dilemma for us is when your enemy is strong, retreat, when your enemy is weak, attack. When they see us being really nice and friendly, they're getting that as a signal they're supposed to become fundamental. I mean, it's really no different than a gang moving into your neighborhood. You call the police show up and arrest the gang. But let's say they've got somebody inside the police department. And you call the police, and instead of the police coming, a gang comes up to your door and says, you snitched on us, if you do it again, we're going to kill you. Are you going to call the police anymore? No. And they get a free rein, they come along. So here is Nikolai Sennels, a psychologist. Muslims instinctively see our lack of reaction as fear. It is an invitation to attack. So another word to define the word innocent. We have the terrorist attacks and politicians tell us, well, those terrorists don't represent true Islam. Because Islam says it's wrong to kill the innocent. Let's define the word innocent. Innocent is a faithful follower of the way of Allah. And if you're not a faithful follower of the way of Allah, you're guilty. And so it says, Allah loveth not those who reject the faith. Be ruthless to the infidel. Make war on the infidel. Fight those who believe not in Allah. Kill the disbeliever wherever we find them. So if you are a non-Muslim, they're ordered to be ruthless and make war, fight, and kill you. So when they say it's wrong to kill the innocent, it's code for it's wrong to kill a faithful Muslim. Now, in all due respect, the fundamentalist Muslims that are doing the killing, they view the large amount of non-violent Muslims as having left the way of Allah, and they're just as happy to kill a non-violent Muslim as they are to kill an infidel. So the non-violent ones are put in this position. When the non-Muslims show themselves strong, they sort of get to be under this umbrella, and they're content to live a secular life. But when the non-Muslim world shows itself weak, and the fundamentalists show themselves strong, they feel this pressure that, I don't want to go that direction, but they'll kill me if I don't, so, and then they end up getting radicalized. Here's Joram Kadari in London. We've had enough of democracy and man-made law. We call for a complete upheaval of the British ruling system and demand full implementation of Sharia in Britain. So there are lots of them that just want to live their lives, but there are these fundamentalist ones that seriously do want to overthrow and have an Arab Spring and set up their fundamentalist government. What Sharia is trying to be like Muhammad, just like Christians want to be like Jesus, Muslims want to be like Muhammad. Simple. Except Christians don't believe they go to heaven by being like Jesus. They go to heaven because they believe Jesus died on the cross to pay for all of their sins. And they're so thankful for it, they want to show everybody else how much God loves them. Not so in Islam. They think their percentage chances of going to paradise is how closely they can follow Muhammad's example. So Muhammad's life is the perfect sunnah, the example. What he permitted is permitted, called halal. What he didn't permit is called haram. And so Sharia is a long list of halals and harams. And the local imam keeps the list. Is this permitted? Yes, that's halal. Is this permitted? No, that's haram. And as long as you're following this list, you're okay. Now, you can't ask why. Well, why is this haram? Why is this not permitted? I'm sorry you can't ask that. But I want to know why. If you ask again, we'll kill you for doubting Islam. You just obey. So it's not a reasoning, deep understanding. It's just an obedience religion. So Muhammad liked cats. Cats are halal. They are permitted. Muhammad did not like dogs. Dogs are haram. They are not permitted. So all the Sharia law is based on Muhammad's preferences, what's permitted, what's not. And it comes from 4 sources. The Quran, we mentioned that already. Private revelations to Muhammad comes in 2 different flavors, so to speak. The Meccan verses, where he's a religious leader, more peaceful. Medina verses, political leader, more violent. Most of Sharia law comes from the Hadith. These are stories remembered about Muhammad by his wives and warriors. Because the goal is to be like Muhammad, and these are Hadiths describing what Muhammad's doing, so it helps you to know how to be like him. So there's 60,000 Hadiths. And then there's the Surat, the biography of Muhammad, written about 100 years after his death. It puts the whole thing in chronological order. If you're going to read anything first, I recommend reading the Surat first instead of reading the Quran first. Because the Western mind likes the outline first, and then you can fill in the details. If you're going to read anything first, I recommend my book. Then there's 1,400 years of rulings of Muslim scholars interpreting the Quran, the Hadith, and the Surat. Very complicated. It decides what you believe, what to eat, how to dress. Ladies, you worry about what to wear. It's all taken care of for you. What direction to pray. You can't just pray in any old direction. It has to be toward Mecca. What position your body's in when you play. How many wives you can have. The correct way to beat a wife. They actually have hadiths that tell you you're not supposed to raise your hand above your head when you strike your wife. You shouldn't strike her on the face, just elsewhere on her body. In this way, Allah is showing honor to the woman. You shouldn't use a stick bigger than your thumb, the rule of thumb. Who must accompany a woman in public? Ladies, I'm sorry, you can't leave the house anymore without a male relative. You know, you're cooking, you need to go to the store and get something. Sorry, you got to have. Now, a little grandson don't count. You can leave that. But if you leave with anybody other than a male relative, you can be accused of rape. And if you're raped, it's your fault, and you get whipped 100 times. Yes?
Quick question about the Quran. I've read that the sections for Medina versus Mecca are interspersed. They're not in order, so you can't
Correct.
find which. Is that correct?
Right. So it was Caliph Uthman that compiled the Quran. Right. So you got Muhammad, Caliph Abu Bakr, who was the father of the 6-year-old that he married, and then you have Caliph Umar, who conquers into Israel. But then you have Caliph Uthman. And by this time, you have different people saying, I remember Muhammad did this, I remember Muhammad did that, sort of contradicting each other. And so he decides to have a standard version. So the word Quran means recitation because it's an oral thing. And Muhammad and his original followers were all illiterate. So it's just an oral passed down thing. Uthman compiles it all in order of length of verse. So the longest verses are at the front, shortest ones in the back. If we did this with the Bible, the first chapter would be Psalms 119, the real long one, and the last verse would be Jesus wept. And but Muslim scholars that dedicate their lives to studying this say, yes, this verse was during this period, this verse was during this period, this chapter's over. Who can be your friends? You're not supposed to be close friends with infidels. They can be, but then when the imam comes in and says, we got to follow the book closer, then they got to sort of withdraw from those relationships. How to treat non-Muslims, you can't drink alcohol. And, so we see this trend, I mentioned, Judeo-Christian, secular, Islamic, gay agenda, and then Islamic. And here's a quote from David Horowitz. The unholy alliance between radical left and radical Islam presents the greatest threat the United States is facing in our time. Islam, liberalism, helping Western civilization commit suicide. So the left, the progressives, is basically the facilitating, the introduction stage. I tell people that multiculturalism is, in a sense, the AIDS virus of Western civilization. So you have a healthy body, a virus comes in, your white blood cells attack it. But if you have AIDS, your white blood cells do not recognize the threat. And the white blood cells sort of stand by while this virus grows and grows and grows and eventually kills you. So if you have a group coming in to your neighborhood that says, we're going to do female genital mutilation, we're going to have little 6-year-old wives, we're going to beat our wives, and you're going to have a bunch of guys show up saying, no way. Police will show up, no way. Judges, no way. But if you have multicultural, no, you can't let them do it. It's their culture. But look what they're doing. No, it's their culture. But no, it's their culture. And they're like, okay. And then they get a chance to grow, and they gradually take over neighborhood after neighborhood. Now, sort of weaving another thread into this, if I hadn't weaved too many in already, is Machiavelli. 500 years ago, he lived in Italy. Italy was a bunch of city-states. Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, they always fought. Machiavelli thought if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he advocates the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is such a good end, because it'll stop the infighting, that any means necessary to get there is justified. Like cheap stealing. So it's really good marketing. Go around the back of the house, set it on fire. Go around the front of the house, sell the fire extinguisher. They'll pay anything for it, and thank you for being there. So if a prince comes in and conquers a city, they hate him. But if the prince pays criminals to create all kinds of crises, the people cry out for help. The prince comes in, gets rid of the people he paid, and everybody praises the prince as a hero.
Oh, wow.
Right? And so it's where you create or capitalize on crisis to consolidate control. Now, a German guy, Hegel, made an equation out of it. It's called Hegelian dialectics. And Germany was not Germany until the late 1800s. It was a bunch of German provinces. Bavaria, Saxony, what were the different ones? All the ones. Anyway, Bismarck unified Germany. But Hegel was the philosopher that sort of gave birth to this idea of Hegelian dialectics. Takes Machiavellianism into an equation. And so it's a triangle. One corner is a thesis, the opposite is an antithesis, and the top corner is a synthesis. So start here, you create a problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for their answer that's half as bad. And then so Karl Marx says, okay, how do you create problems real bad? Send in agitators, agent provocateurs, or community organizers. Their goal is to find people with grievances, and you stir up until there's a crisis. And then everybody says, we need the government to come in and restore order. Government comes in, collects everybody's guns, and they restore order. When the dust settles, you've just transitioned from you ruling yourself to a governor, a king, 45 countries follow communism this way. And so the communists would organize the proletariat against the bourgeois, which is the working class against the business owners. They'd organize the poor against the rich, blacks against the whites, Catholics against the Protestants, so forth. Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo. They really don't care who the two sides are, and they don't care what the issues are. They just want to find people who have grievances, stir them up until there's lawlessness, and then everybody cries for the government to come in, and the government takes away all the powers. And so, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip past some stuff. So David Horowitz says, the issue is never the issue is always the revolution. They really don't care about Confederate flags and statues of Stonewall Jackson. They don't care about those things. They just want to find something to bring about lawlessness. And the people that are actually doing the rioting, Lenin called them useful idiots. And so they do the rioting, and the revolution needs the enemy, the revolution needs the antithesis, says Castro. So it needs somebody to organize against. Saul Alinsky, Hillary Clinton did her senior thesis at Wellesley College on Saul Alinsky, and Obama was a Saul Alinsky community organizer. He says the organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems. The organizer must rub raw the resentments of the people of the community, stir up dissatisfaction and discontent, fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. Organizer polarizes the issue, helps lead his forces into conflict. He must search out controversy, for unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. So, this is a political strategy where you need to have all kinds of riots and crises. And who can help bring these riots and crises? If you allow a lot of people that like to do riots and crises, and you open the borders and let them come in, and you put them in all kinds of different cities, MS-13 gang members coming in, and so you have them, all these pockets to organize them, and they're all ready to do rioting. So anyway, I just thought I'd come and give you a little encouragement tonight. Send you out there. And anyway, Proverbs 6 is explained to 6 things the Lord hates. Proud look, lying tongue, and it says, he that soweth discord amongst the brethren. So that's the community organizer's job. to sow discord. Now, flipping completely to a different angle is the prophecy. I'm not a prophecy scholar, but I think you'll find this interesting. Daniel was interpreting a dream for Nebuchadnezzar. And it's a statue with a head of gold, arms and chest of silver, abdomen of bronze, and then the legs of iron, and then the feet iron and clay. And they're kingdoms that go from a greater level to a lower level. And so we got Babylon, Persia, Greece, but everybody pretty well figures that the legs are Rome, the Roman Empire, and they break into East and Western Roman Empire. And then what's the clay? Well, the East and West Roman Empire, what did it turn into? Well, it turned into maybe Germany and England and France and America. And what's the clay? It's so low, it's not even a country. It's maybe groups coming in that are not assimilating. They're not becoming the lead, right? They're keeping their own identity, their own language, their own culture, and it's breaking up these countries that are left over from the Roman Empire. Sort of interesting. Matter of fact, anyway, I'll leave it with that. And so could the Muslim refuge coming to the west be the clay? Now, I thought, how does God judge a nation? Deuteronomy 28 tells us. If the nation hearkens to the voice of the Lord, they'll be above and not beneath, head not the tail, a lender, not a borrower. It says if the nation does not hearken to the voice of the Lord, it says the stranger amongst them will rise up and be their ruler. And let's read the verse in the one translation. If you don't hearken to the voice of the Lord, the foreigners living amongst you will get more and more power, and you will lose power you had. The foreigners will have money loaned to you, but you will not have any money loaned to them. They will control you by the way the head controls the body. You will be the tail because you did not listen to the Lord. So how did God judge Israel? He let them get overrun by foreigners. The Amalekites, the Hittites, the Moabites, the Parasites, the Mosquitobites, the Trilobites, the Millerites, I don't know, all the ites. And so the way God judges his people is he lets them come in. And now I thought another thing interesting. Muhammad traced his lineage through Ishmael. Ishmael was what? He was the son that was sent away. Yeah. So Ishmael's view of Abraham's God was this God who sends you away. He's arbitrary. You want to please him. You want to get into his presence, but you never can. And so this distant God has been part into that line. We see here that the Jews and Christians trace their lineage through Isaac, the son that stayed. And so Isaac was like, my dad loves me. My dad is with me all the time. Everything my dad has, he gives to me. My dad and I are so close. It's this intimate God of Abraham. And that's what the Jews and Christians have. Another way to look at it is Cain and Abel. Cain wanted to worship God, but he wanted to do it through works. And we know it's works because God told Adam, the ground is cursed for your sake, and you'll bring forth fruit by the sweat of your brow. So here's Cain working. Do his works make him acceptable to God? No. Abel approaches God through the lamb. It's this lamb takes the punishment for all of my sins. And so when Cain's offering, and so Islam, there's no lamb in their theology. It's just works. And so when you do works, you can be proud of your works. You did more works than the other guy, so you can be proud of it. And when Cain's works were rejected, it says his countenance fell. His pride was hurt. He was offended. Right? And Islam is a religion of pride. They call it honor, but it's pride. I mean, they'll kill their own daughter if she embarrasses them. And so, what was Cain's response when his works were rejected? He got filled full of hatred and anger and wanted to murder his brother that had the revelation of the Lamb. And murder the Jews and the Christians. Anyway. Now, one of the best stories we love in the Bible, they're the ones where things look hopeless and God raises up little nobodies who step forward with faith and courage to save the day. And so here we are today, and there's lots of different things. If the judgment comes, well, what do you do when you're judged? You repent really fast. Tomorrow, they're honoring or that's not the right word, but they're commemorating the pro-life event. Over 60 million people have been murdered through abortion. And if there's one thing God hates, it's the shedding of innocent blood. God told Cain, you murdered your brother. Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. What was it crying? An injustice is done. You're a just God. You got to judge the guy that did it. And God's a just God. He tries to put off judgment, but he has to judge sometime or the other. Otherwise, he's unjust. Otherwise, he's giving consent to the sin. Silence equals consent. He's got to judge. And now that's why Jesus came. Jesus took the judgment. So if we're in Christ, our judgment's been paid. And if you're not in Christ, then he's a just God. He has to judge everything wrong that you did. Otherwise, he's an unjust God. And anyway, so you read the Old Testament. There's a Hezekiah, good king, and he has a son Manasseh. Manasseh's wicked. Manasseh's sacrificing his own kids to Moloch. Prophets come to him and said, "You're filling the streets of Jerusalem with the blood of these innocent. They're killing all these innocent kids and altars all around the city of Jerusalem." And God said, "It is over." And now his grandson Josiah repents, and for this brief period, about 30 years, God holds back the judgment, and there's a revival. But then it finally hits, and all of Israel is carried away captive because of the shedding of innocent blood. And so I really do think that if there is a God, I believe there is, and he's a just God who hates the shedding of innocent blood, and we've been shedding innocent blood in America, sooner or later he's got to judge. Well, how does God historically judge? As he lets the stranger come in and rise up above his people and oppress them. That's what he did with Israel. And what do you do when you're judged? You repent really fast. And you get back to personally, all repentance is personal. It's you begin to reform your life, come back to the Lord, right? Believe in Jesus that he paid for your sins, but then get back to filling your mind with God's word and not a bunch of trash. I've got the Bible on an app on my phone where I can actually read the Bible to me, right? So instead of listening to the radio, I'll listen to the Bible. I signed up for this one where you get the email every day. It sends you a little Old Testament and a little New Testament. And in a year, you read the whole Bible. I mean, how much easier can it get? And I was thinking, how many of us get emails? Would you read an email from someone important in your life? Maybe your wife or your boss, right? Who could be more important than God? So it's like getting an email from God, right? And say, "Oh, I'll read it later." It's like, no, just read it now. And anyway, so there's personally getting back and seeking the Lord and being filled with the Spirit. But then it happens as a family and as a church and as a country, and then it happens. But all repentance is personal. Anyway, I have a website, AmericanMinute.com, and I send out a free daily email called American Minute, and I have all my books there, and plus the books on the table. You've been so kind to listen to me for all this time. Did you get anything out of this?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Andrew. Yes.
Can we ask a question?
All right.
Erdogan there was a coup about 1.5 years ago. Do you think he staged the coup
Yes.
to be able to take over his country? He used the person in the United States as the person that
Correct.
did the coup.
Gulen.
So now he's converting. Him and Iran and Russia are going to join together. And we now have, 15 nuclear weapons in his country. Do you think we're going to get out of the country?
I don't know about that, but I do know that it had all the earmarks of a staged coup.
Yes.
And the people that I talked to said that the people in the military didn't even know what happened. It was just like, some cars going around, and all of a sudden he said that the next week he has a list of 30,000 people that are all of his political enemies. They all get rounded up and they get locked away.
There's hundreds of thousands of them now.
Yes, I was taking an Uber, and the girl driving was from Turkey, studying to be a nurse. I said, "Oh, are you going to go back afterwards?" She goes, "No, they'll arrest me. I hate Erdogan. He wants Sharia. He wants to bring Sharia because I'm from Izmir, which is the old Ephesus. And we're on the beach, and we like to go to the beach, and we like to dance and even drink, and we don't like this Sharia." And she knows people that are in prison. And so then this one area, all the policemen didn't like Erdogan. What does he do? He fires them all and brings in his people. So yeah, there is a real serious change happening in Turkey. We need to pray for the people over there because there's a lot of real decent people that just want to live their lives. Yes?
One other question. There's a fundamental change going on in Saudi Arabia right now. Do you think it'll stay?
What's going on in Saudi Arabia? I don't know. But my initial response is I'm happy with it.
Well,
I don't know if it's going to be a long-term... Excuse me?
They're trying to do away with
Yes,
Wahhabi.
trying to do away with the Wahhabi.
Now that women can drive cars. They're not.
Go to movie theaters.
Right.
Yeah, so that looks very good and hopeful. The prince that was arrested, Al-Walid bin Talal,
Right.
was like one of the richest men in the world, and he was like one of the main guys spreading fundamentalist Islam,
Right.
buying ownership in AOL, Disney, and Citibank, and these different things. I don't quite understand all that's happening. What I see seems to be good. It looks like Saudi Arabia is even working together with Israel on some things. The long-term trajectory of where it's all headed, I don't know. But I do think that it's something I didn't expect. And any step, I think, is in a good direction. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to
Let's thank Bill. Thanks to